In understanding the cultural defense system around maintaining sexual abuse, both transmitting it and receiving it, the first thing to do is step back and just understand what a cult or culture is. And the primary function of a cult or culture is to establish behavior memes and norms that create and then maintain a status quo. And these evolve slowly, but the primary purpose of a culture is to create flow. In American culture, people say, "How you doing? How are you? How you doing? How are you?" And the typical answer is fine, or so-so, or there's a little bit of facial gesticulation, but typically this is supposed to be a 1 or 2 second interaction. And it's also typically dishonest, meaning no one's answering this question fully, and very few people are asking it with a sincere interest. It's a meme, it's a protocol. And as a result, you can ask 20 people this question and get 20 answers and have very little idea of what's going on beneath the surface of these people's lives. Is it good? Is it bad? It's normal. It's a cultural norm. And the purpose of cultural norms is to create one could look at it through the lens of brain development. And one of the things that we know is the amygdala, the fear brain, wakes up anytime there's an anomaly, anytime something's new. Particularly in traumatic cultures, newness represents danger. Because when you have a lot of pain in your past, it leads to fear. Fear of what? Fear of the pain in the past recreating in the future. Literally, if you are born without trauma and experience no trauma and no pain for the first 10 years of your life, something that does not exist in the United States and most of our cultures, there is no fear. There's no fear except when very painful events do not fully get resolved, and so there is reason to believe that they may happen again. If you've been raped and nobody helped and protected the rape, and nobody helped to clean up the terror and grief and sadness after the rape, then you would have reason to be afraid of the rape happening again. What doesn't get resolved in the past is likely to repeat to some degree in the future. And this is why action is important to interrupt an abuse cycle. It's why going to a martial arts course or getting pepper spray or getting a concealed handgun can be empowering to break the cycle for a terrified, traumatized sexual abuse survivor. Because if one doesn't do this, one cannot predict when one might be walking around when nobody's looking. One cannot predict when someone might break into the house. And one certainly cannot say that a culture that has managed to produce sexual predators for centuries is suddenly going to stop producing them. So in order to interrupt the cycle of sexual predation, the logical conclusion is not that they're suddenly going to vanish, but that this time when a predator comes, I will have a different response. I will have a different capacity of resistance and defense than I did before, and thus the cycle will not repeat itself. As a result, fear goes down. And this, of course, correlates with well-being. So the amygdala registers the fear of the unknown. And cultures produce a known quantity, a norm, a status quo. And as a result, the amygdala calms down. The reptilian brain calms down. And we feel relaxed, which is a necessary state to be creative, to enjoy life in any way. And so a culture's primary goal is to establish an identity of repeated interactions that are considered normal. Because although there have been 10,000 cultures in human history, and although none of them have been correct in either the scientific sense or in measuring, a perfect score in intelligence. So in a scientific sense, you think, does this culture follow the data, or does it just do its thing? And almost all cultures have a terrain that's the cultish aspect of the culture that has nothing to do with data and everything to do with often an outdated hypothesis that has long been proved wrong by data, but has been entrenched in tradition. And this is part of the cult. Now, on the intelligence metric, intelligence can be measured by the efficiency with which energy, time, money, natural resources, attention, emotion, electricity, with which energy is transformed into sustainable human well-being. You know you're dealing with an intelligent culture, with an intelligent individual, with an intelligent school, when it's able to take the time, money, and natural resources allocated to it and produce more sustainable well-being per unit of energy invested than its comparison, because it's an infinite continuum. The most intelligent system, the most intelligent culture, the most intelligent human being that could possibly exist would take a few seconds, almost no natural resources, and a few pennies, and would leverage that in a design pattern that rippled out, creating a chain reaction of vast amounts of sustainable human well-being. And when you compare that to the opposite extreme of taking massive amounts of money, massive amounts of time, and consuming vast quantities of natural resources to increase the net level of misery, the net level of chronic suffering for a wide number of people, you have the antithesis of intelligence. You have stupidity, taking a lot of energy to make things worse. Because in the history of humankind, every human being wants to feel sustainably good and wants to avoid feeling chronically bad. And in the interrelated ecology, the viral nature of human beings says that if you're surrounded by incredibly miserable people, it's a lot harder to be happy sustainably than if you are surrounded by ethical, intelligent, self-loving, healthy, talented individuals that are collaborating to bring their gifts into the world and share them. So every cult in human history has been more intelligent in some areas and less in others, and has been more scientific in some areas and less than others. And so these are two continuums of that are worth referencing, science. And the reason that science is intelligent is that when you have statistical corollary data with a hypothesis that seems to explain, let's say, 90+% of what's likely to happen, you are able to intelligently spend less energy to create more human well-being. And so cults are not scientific and they are not intelligent by nature. They are normal by nature. And this is a problem when it comes to a chronic tradition, to a chronic history of sexual abuse, primarily of males towards females. Primarily. So let's say, that 3/4 of the sexual violation occurs from males to females. And one of the reasons for this is that, statistically speaking, male bodies are larger and stronger and more aggressive with the testosterone tendency to act, and the build, that has an edge both stereotypically, which ties in with the cult self-image. Self-image tends to be self-perpetuating. So when you consider men and going to war and stuff like that, you develop a mindset that leans towards aggression, and then you've also got a body that is more capable. Why do they not have male and female boxers in the same ring? Because statistically speaking, it would be unfair to women. So you have female and female boxers, and female Olympic runners, etc., to acknowledge the difference, statistically speaking, in the body. Now, the purpose of every cult is primarily to maintain a status quo, which through repeated exposure allows people to relax with whatever it is that's going on. And one could say the logic of a status quo is that this has been happening for some time, and most of the people in this system are not dead. Okay, so there's a reasonable chance that if I do what everyone else is doing, that I'll get to the end of my day and not be dead. So I might as well relax. Now, as soon as you encounter something new, something that's never been done before, that equation is up for grabs. I've not seen a large majority of people do this. I don't have the intelligence to predict the outcome with confidence. I'm afraid of the unknown based on the fact that a lot of the abuses and pains in my past occurred as surprises. I don't like surprises because surprises are often painful based on the number of things that have surprised me in my life and how much pain or pleasure has occurred as a result of those surprises. That tells me how much I like a surprise, which tells me how much I like something new, which tells me how resistant I am to the unknown. Now, it's worth noting that while cults operate within a very familiar terrain to themselves, a self-referential loop, where we do this because we do this, and we do it because we did it, and we did it because it was the thing to do, and that's why we did it, and so we're doing it, and we're going to do it again. There's no reference to data, there's no reference to intelligence, there's no reference to possibility. There's no reference to the unknown. A self-referential status quo has nothing to refer to except itself. And it operates because it calms people down, because it's become the norm. Now, this is great when it's the norm to wash hands before, doing a heart surgery, a heart transplant surgery. It's wonderful to have that be a norm. That's a science-based norm of sterilizing, etc. When Louis Pasteur came along and wondered why so many people were dying after successful amputations, he postulated that there must be something invisible that was being transferred into the patient that was killing most of the surgery patients at the time. And all the doctors laughed at Louis Pasteur. Louis Pasteur is the founder of pasteurization. And he postulated the germ before it was visible. And no one wanted to listen to Louis Pasteur because they had norms. They had norms that said that good old rational materialist science said, if we can't see it, it doesn't exist. It's superstitious, right? And they couldn't see germs. So they continued to murder their patients dogmatically. They maintained the status quo, even though Louis Pasteur showed them that if you wash your hands and sterilize your instruments, fewer patients died. Now, what Louis Pasteur's colleagues were asked to contemplate was change. And they were asked to contemplate a change they didn't understand. And this brings up fear. This brings up resistance to the unknown, particularly in a traumatic culture. And the evidence was perfectly clear. Fewer of Louis Pasteur's surgical patients were dying. More of his colleagues' patients were dying. Now, a doctor swears an oath to do what's good for the client, what's good for the patient. So this creates an obvious opportunity for change. But it invoked something that science was fighting at the time, which was the mysterious. And Louis Pasteur couldn't explain germs because he couldn't see them any more than anyone else. All he could do is say, guys, if you'll wash your hands, and of course these were male surgeons, another time from the depth of chauvinism at the time. Of course, there couldn't be female surgeons. If there are male, guys, if you will wash your hands, there's probably something that we can't see, but I guarantee you your patients will live longer. You'll have more successful recoveries. They wouldn't do it because it seemed like it was too close to superstition. And so they continued to murder their patients. Now, in these dogmatic areas, we don't see science, we see dogma. Is there anything wrong scientifically with washing one's hands before the microscope was invented? No. But why do scientists cling so hard to rationalist, reductionist, materialist science? Is it out of a fear of the unknown, a fear of mystery? Is it a traumatic response to early childhood terrors that took them into the timeless space of PTSD and trauma? And they never wanted to be uncertain again. They wanted to be in control. And here was Louis Pasteur saying, you can save more of your patients if you'll allow for the mystery of the unknown. You don't have to give up on science. You just have to allow that perhaps in a few years when the microscope is invented, you will see what it is I'm talking about. For now, just look at the corollary data. Put your patients first. Well, like so many dogmatists, they put their dogma first. If I can't see it, says at the time the rationalist, materialist scientist, if I can't see it, it doesn't exist. And the more we get to know, the more we understand that we don't know very much. Because the universe is a very big place. And it's just part of a multiverse, which is even bigger. 99.9% of all reality is not only unknown, it is unknown. And when you have fear of the unknown, this is an overwhelming terror. It collapses and paralyzes the ego. And so we seek to create a false sense of certainty by repeating and staying in a very small box and repeating norms, repeating cult memes. And that's how we get our cult. Now, some areas the cult is great, but the amount of incest, the amount of rape, the amount of sex under the influence of manipulation and bullying, the amount of sex under the influence of judgment-inhibiting drugs, which lead to inadvisable pregnancies, which lead to inadvisable risks for STDs, which lead to regretted sexual experiences once someone sobers up. The amount of sexual abuse that goes on in our cult is, and for a very long time has been, enormous. It is a staggering amount of less than optimal sexuality. And we're not even getting into the marital sex is boring and all of this. Our cult is doing a terrible job of raising healthy adults capable, with a high degree of certainty, of living sexually fulfilled, consensual, healthy, and sustainable sexual lives that lead to a growing amount of well-being. And yet, despite the evidence of sexual frustration, despite the evidence of ill-advised pregnancies leading to sustained childhood abuse, despite the evidence of addictions, despite the tremendous amount of marital strife, even in healthy domestic relationships where 1 in 3 domestic couples experience some degree of domestic violence. 1 in 3. Even with these staggering statistics that are screaming about pain, the cult's job is not, as it forms itself in a self-referential loop, the cult's job is not to be intelligent. The cult's job is not to be scientific, which is a subset of intelligence. The cult's job is to maintain the status quo, however effective or ineffective that status quo may be. And the cult has a set of mechanisms through which to maintain the status quo of sexual abuse. And the first one is chauvinism. And it's a very deep and deeply entrenched mechanism, because what chauvinism says, borrowing from a Frenchman, Mr. Chauvin, what chauvinism says is that everything that is feminine, first of all, you have the whole. In the Chinese symbol of yin and yang, yin is feminine, yang is masculine. You have the circle, you have the whole. And you cut the whole in half. And now you have polarity. Now you have contrast and distinction. Now you have choice. Now you have 2 parts of the whole. You have polarity. Well, what Mr. Chauvin came along and had the brilliant idea of doing was saying, and brilliant in quotes, of course, was saying that this half of the whole was innately superior, innately better than, innately more valuable, innately more important than this half of the whole. That masculinity, in all of its expressions, is more valuable than femininity in all of its expressions. So masculinity must be taken seriously, femininity not so much. Males are more important, females not so much. In the masculine and feminine polarity of exchanging energy, if you look at any human relationship dynamic, look at communication. You have two parts of communication, speaking and listening. If you speak but don't listen, there's no communication. If you listen but don't speak, there's no communication. If you speak very well but listen very poorly, there's weak communication. If you speak very poorly but listen very well, there's weak communication. And if you speak very well and listen very well, there's great communication. So this is polarity in play. It's the exact same thing for giving, exchanging energy. So that's exchanging communication. You have a speaker and a listener. Exchanging energy, you have a giver and you a receiver. Exchanging money, a subset of energy, you have a buyer and a seller. The exact same dynamics occur. There is a feminine pole, there is a masculine pole in every human exchange. And what Mr. Chauvin wants to say, and we're still listening to a Frenchman hundreds of years later, what Chauvin wanted to say was that all masculine things are more important than feminine things. So, of course, a boy is more important than a girl. And so, we're still deluged with cult norms of movies from the 50s. It's a boy. Who says that about a girl? In China, where they had the one-child policy, they would take the little girls, wrap her in plastic and throw it in a dumpster and try again so that the one child could be a boy. Because they understand chauvinism as well. Chauvinism is a very deeply ingrained cult phenomena that made sense in tribal warfare, where the biggest alpha males would do battle and the winner would take all. It made sense in tribal warfare. It does not make sense in democracy. It does not make sense in the information age. It makes sense that if you're crossing the Alps in 10 degrees below zero, that your tribe has some connection between having a 6'2" muscular grunt of a man who's going to carry the sled over the pass. Now, admittedly, if your tribe dies because there is no alpha male and the more delicate younger bodies of children, etc., they can't get through those elements, then you could say, well, such is life, but you can't value aesthetics if you're dead. And so in highly traumatic earth environments, let's say 200 years ago and going back to some thousands of years ago, when the Westerners are settling in the West, the bigger horse that carries your wagon there first or whatever it is, you can say that brawn, the physical attributes of a male, has some benefit. But Mr. Chauvin went much further than this kind of clearly outdated chauvinism. It's outdated because you and I are not determining our survival on a daily basis on whether we wrestled a tiger to the ground. We're both typing away with our thumbs. And who's to say that women might not be able to do that better than a male, or certainly as good? I mean, there's no touchscreens do not require, 10 pounds pressure, etc. It's an irrelevant trait to a different environment. But cults are self-referential. They don't change with data. They change very, very slowly and often out of sync with data, much like our own. Why do we have a Mr. Universe but not a Mr. Kindness? What's more relevant to the species' survival? Seeing choreographed muscles built with steroids? lifting more weights just for the competition. It's not like people are using this skill in daily life and then they go around and round up a bunch of auto mechanics. No. People stop doing useful things like auto mechanics to train to be Mr. Universe, making them less functional for the well-being of the culture than if they were auto mechanics with fewer muscles. So that's the kind of the insanity. But there is a Mr. Universe competition. There isn't a Mr. Kindness competition. There isn't a Mr. Intelligence competition with intelligence defined as the efficiency with which energy is transformed into sustainable well-being. And there isn't a Miss Intelligence competition. There isn't a Miss Sustainability competition that says this person brought more symmetry, health, and sustainable practices to the environment than any other thing. So this chauvinism that says that speaking is more important than listening, that the giver is more valuable than the receiver, that the initiator is more important than the responder, that the leader should get an award but not the follower, that the teacher is more valuable than the student. This emphasis of the masculine pole, and that order is more important than chaos. You have the old Star Wars dichotomy. The rebels and the empire. The empire is the cult that is going to kill off your humanity by bringing order to the galaxy of your mind, the galaxy of your heart, the galaxy of your family. It's going to kill off and dominate who you are to bring consistency, to bring a status quo that has nothing to do with the underlying science that it apparently, cults like to talk about themselves as intelligent. And to do that, they have to ignore all the other cultures or be very selective, because every cult is good at something and it's terrible at other things. So in order to maintain your cult, your status quo, you've got to pretend that these are the only things that matter. And in order to pretend that, you've got to bolster those things up and then call those things the good things, and then look at the way that you're doing that better than some other country, etc. America is very good at saying it's number one, but it's not actually at number one in the vast majority of things. Paid maternity leave? No. It's number one in obesity, but if you look closely at what America is doing better than any culture in human history and what it's doing much worse than any culture in human history, it's an incredibly unintelligent culture. And so this is just a little bit of a lead-in to why intelligent, science-based, empathy-based changes in how people interact will be and are and have been fought tooth and nail by the element in the culture that doesn't want to think, that doesn't want to face the unknown, that doesn't want to risk change, that is frightened of the norm, of the status quo shifting into something that loses the cohesion, that we all decide and we all define that this is okay because everyone's doing it.